The gleaming halls of Atlanta International Airport buzzed with the usual morning rush as Lieutenant Colonel Michelle Chen made her way through the crowded terminal. Her polished boots clicked against the floor, matching the rhythm of rolling suitcases and hurried footsteps around her. After spending the last 15 months leading critical missions in Afghanistan, she was finally heading to the Pentagon for a briefing that could shape her entire career. The first-class ticket in her hand felt like a small victory. She'd never been one to splurge, always sending most of her military pay back home to help her aging parents with their medical bills. But today was different. Her recent promotion called for a celebration, even if it was just a comfortable seat on a 3-hour flight. The morning sun streamed through the terminal's massive windows, casting long shadows across the busy walkway. Michelle adjusted her perfectly pressed uniform and checked her watch. Still 45 minutes before boarding. Just enough time to grab a coffee and review her presentation notes one last time. As she walked toward the coffee shop, she couldn't help but smile at a young girl who pointed at her uniform and whispered excitedly to her mother. 15 years in service had taught Michelle that these small moments mattered just as much as the big ones. She'd seen too much during her tours not to appreciate everyday peace. The barista at the coffee counter beamed when Michelle ordered her usual black coffee. "On the house," he said with a genuine smile. "My brother's in the Air Force." Michelle tried to insist on paying, but the young man wouldn't hear of it. These random acts of kindness always reminded her why she loved serving her country. Finding a quiet spot near her gate, Michelle pulled out her laptop. The presentation she'd be giving at the Pentagon wasn't just another briefing. It was about the school-building initiative she'd spearheaded in remote Afghan villages. Under her leadership, her team had helped establish 3 schools, creating safe spaces for hundreds of young girls to learn and grow. The before and after photos on her screen told a story of hope and transformation. The boarding area started filling up as flight time approached. Michelle noticed the usual mix of business travelers in their sharp suits, families heading on vacation, and a few other service members. She struck up a conversation with an elderly couple celebrating their 50th anniversary with a trip to D.C. They shared stories about their grandchildren, and Michelle found herself sharing tales about the young Afghan girls who'd taught her to make traditional bread during her deployment. As the gate agent began setting up for boarding, Michelle gathered her things and headed to the priority line. The first-class ticket felt even more special now, a quiet moment to herself before the intensity of the Pentagon briefing. She stood tall in her uniform, not out of pride but out of respect for what it represented. Years of service, countless sacrifices, and the unwavering belief that everyone deserves dignity and opportunity. The morning light caught her lieutenant colonel insignia, making it gleam. A nearby toddler pointed and clapped, bringing another smile to Michelle's face. These were the moments that reminded her why she chose this path, not for the recognition or the rank, but for the chance to make a difference, one day at a time. Little did she know that this ordinary morning at Atlanta International was about to become anything but ordinary, and her training in handling high-pressure situations would be tested in an unexpected way. The gate agent called for first-class boarding, and Michelle stepped forward with her ticket in hand. That's when she heard it, a loud scoff from behind her. She'd heard that sound before, too many times to count, but she'd learned long ago that staying professional was the best response. "Excuse me," came a sharp voice. "I believe this is the first-class line." A man in an expensive gray suit stepped forward, his leather briefcase probably worth more than 3 months of Michelle's housing allowance. He looked at her as if she was invisible, speaking instead to the gate agent. There must be some confusion here. The gate agent, a young woman with kind eyes, glanced at Michelle's ticket and then back at the man. "Sir, this passenger has a valid first-class ticket. She's in the correct line." The man, who would later introduce himself as Mr. Harrison, straightened his silk tie and spoke louder, as if volume would somehow make him right. "Look, I fly this route every week. I know every regular in first class, and I've never seen—" Well, he gestured vaguely at Michelle. not finishing his sentence, but making his meaning crystal clear. Other passengers had stopped their conversations, turning to watch the scene unfold. Michelle could feel their eyes on her, but she kept her expression neutral. Years of commanding troops in high-pressure situations had taught her that losing your cool never solved anything. "Perhaps you could double-check her ticket," Mr. Harrison continued, now addressing the gate agent's supervisor who had walked over to investigate the commotion. "These things can get mixed up in the system sometimes." A businessman waiting in line spoke up. "Are you seriously suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" His voice carried a mix of disbelief and anger. "Because it sounds like you're saying someone in uniform, someone who serves our country, doesn't belong in first class because of how she looks." Michelle raised her hand slightly, the same calm gesture she used to quiet her troops during briefings. "It's all right," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Mr. Harrison, would you like to see my ticket? Or perhaps you'd be interested in hearing about the briefing I'm heading to at the Pentagon. I'd be happy to tell you about our humanitarian missions overseas." The calm confidence in her voice made several people nod in approval. An elderly woman in a floral dress stepped closer to Michelle. "I've been flying for 50 years, young man," she addressed Mr. Harrison, "and I've never seen such disrespect. This officer has earned her seat twice over, once by paying for it, and 1,000 times over by serving our country." Mr. Harrison's face had turned an interesting shade of red, but Michelle wasn't done. She pulled out her phone and showed him a photo. "This is from last month," she explained, her voice still kind despite everything. "We just finished building our 3rd school for girls in a remote Afghan village. Those smiles you see, they're from children who never thought they'd get an education. That's what this uniform represents: hope, service, and the belief that everyone deserves respect." The gate area had grown so quiet you could hear the distant announcements from other terminals. Other passengers had their phones out, but not to record the confrontation. They were looking up news articles about the school building initiative. Someone found a recent piece about Michelle's promotion and the lives she'd impacted. Mr. Harrison's expensive shoes suddenly seemed very interesting to him as he stared at the floor. The gate agent began scanning tickets, and other passengers made a point of letting Michelle board first. As she walked past Mr. Harrison, she paused briefly. "There's always room for growth," she said quietly. "That's what makes our country great. We can learn from our mistakes and do better tomorrow." The story was far from over, but in that moment, standing in her crisp uniform with her head held high, Michelle had already won something more important than an argument. She'd shown everyone watching that dignity and grace were stronger than prejudice. Mr. Harrison's face flushed darker as more passengers pulled up their phones, murmuring about the articles they'd found. "Lieutenant Colonel helps build schools in war zone," one passenger read aloud. The atmosphere in the gate area had shifted dramatically. What started as an uncomfortable confrontation was turning into something quite different. I had no idea," Mr. Harrison stammered, his earlier arrogance melting away. "I just assumed." He stopped, finally hearing how his words sounded. The leather briefcase he'd been clutching like a shield now hung limply at his side. A young woman in Air Force fatigues who had been quietly watching stepped forward. "Sir," she addressed Mr. Harrison, "I served under the lieutenant colonel during my first deployment. Do you know what she did when our supply convoy was attacked?" She looked at Michelle with deep respect. "She led a rescue mission that saved not just our troops, but 3 local families caught in the crossfire. She didn't care about anyone's background that day, just about saving lives." The gate agent, who had been professionally handling the situation, couldn't help but smile. "Colonel," she said, "my brother's stationed in Afghanistan right now. He told me about the schools you helped build. They're changing lives." Michelle adjusted her uniform jacket, more uncomfortable with the praise than she had been with the confrontation. "The real heroes are the local teachers," she said. "They show up every day, despite the risks, because they believe in a better future for their students." An older gentleman in a business suit stepped out of line. "I've been in business for 40 years," he said, addressing Mr. Harrison. "And the most valuable lesson I've learned is that leadership isn't about how important you think you are. It's about how you lift others up." He gestured toward Michelle. "That's real leadership right there." Mr. Harrison looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "Colonel," he said, his voice much quieter now, "I owe you an apology. My behavior was... there's no excuse for it." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I've been flying this route every week for 5 years, always in first class, always feeling like it made me somehow better than others. Today you showed me what real class looks like, and it has nothing to do with airline seats." Michelle met his eyes with the same steady gaze she used when mentoring young officers. "We all have moments that define us, Mr. Harrison. It's not about the mistakes we make. It's about how we learn from them." A small girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, is that lady a hero?" she asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. Her mother smiled and nodded. "Yes, sweetie, in more ways than one." The boarding process resumed, but something had changed in that gate area. Passengers who had been strangers moments ago were sharing stories about their own experiences with prejudice and learning. An elderly couple talked about the civil rights movement they'd lived through. A college student shared how his immigrant parents faced similar situations. As Michelle finally stepped onto the jet bridge, the gate agent handed her boarding pass back with a note scribbled on it. "Thank you for showing us what strength really looks like." Behind her, she could hear Mr. Harrison asking the young Air Force member more questions about her service, genuinely listening to the answers. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the jet bridge, and Michelle took a deep breath. In a few hours, she'd be giving her Pentagon briefing about building bridges between cultures. She smiled, realizing she'd just given an unplanned demonstration of exactly that. As Michelle settled into her first-class seat, she noticed something unexpected. Instead of the usual quiet shuffle of boarding, passengers were stopping to share words of encouragement. A flight attendant brought her a fresh cup of coffee. "From all of us," she said with a warm smile. 2 rows behind her, the young Air Force member was still deep in conversation with Mr. Harrison. Their voices carried forward, talking about military service, family, and the challenges of being away from home. The transformation in Mr. Harrison's attitude wasn't just visible. You could hear it in his voice. "My grandfather served in World War II," an elderly passenger shared as he stored his bag overhead. "He always said the uniform doesn't make the soldier. It's what's in their heart that counts." He patted the seat next to Michelle. "Mind if I join you? I'd love to hear more about those schools you built." The elderly man, a retired teacher himself, listened intently as Michelle described the excitement on the young girls' faces when they first received their textbooks. "Education changes everything," he nodded. "I taught for 40 years in a small town, and I've seen it firsthand." A woman across the aisle pulled out her tablet. "I'm a journalist," she explained, "and I've covered stories about military humanitarian missions. But hearing about your work firsthand..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Would you mind if I wrote about what happened today? Not the confrontation, but the way you turned it into a teaching moment." Before Michelle could answer, Mr. Harrison spoke up from his seat. "If you write that story," he said, his voice carrying a hint of emotion, "make sure you mention how one person's grace can change many people's perspectives. I'm not proud of how I acted, but I'm grateful for the lesson." The plane filled up, but it wasn't like any other flight. Usually, first-class passengers kept to themselves, hidden behind newspapers or laptops. Today, there was a sense of community. A businessman shared pictures of his daughter, who was applying to West Point. The elderly teacher talked about his years working in underprivileged schools. The flight attendant doing final checks paused at Michelle's row. "My sister's in the Peace Corps," she shared quietly. "She says the hardest part isn't the work. It's dealing with people's assumptions. The way you handled things back there. Well, she would have been proud." As the plane began to push back from the gate, Michelle noticed something remarkable. The usual invisible barrier between first class and economy had somehow dissolved. Passengers from both cabins were sharing smiles and nods, united by what they'd witnessed at the gate. A young girl, sitting with her mother in economy, waved at Michelle through the gap between seats. "I want to be like you when I grow up," she called out, making several passengers smile. Her mother looked embarrassed, but Michelle waved back. "Study hard and be kind," she said. "That's all it takes." The captain's voice came over the intercom, starting the usual pre-flight announcements. But then he added something unusual. "We have several service members on board today, including a decorated lieutenant colonel. On behalf of our crew, thank you for your service, not just to our country, but to communities around the world." Mr. Harrison, who had chosen a seat where he could still participate in the conversations, cleared his throat. "You know," he said, addressing no one in particular but speaking loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "I came to the airport today thinking I was important because of my frequent flyer status. I'm leaving with a completely different understanding of what truly matters." As the plane accelerated down the runway, Michelle closed her eyes briefly. Her Pentagon presentation was about building bridges between cultures, about seeing past differences to find common ground. Somehow, in the middle of Atlanta International Airport, she'd just given the most important version of that presentation, not with PowerPoint slides, but with real human connection. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt signs dinged off, and something extraordinary started happening. Passengers who'd witnessed the gate incident began sharing their own stories, turning the first-class cabin into an impromptu community gathering. A middle-aged businessman leaned forward from his seat. "You mentioned building schools," he said to Michelle. "My company does educational outreach, but we've never considered international projects." He pulled out his business card. "Would you be willing to tell me more about the challenges you faced? Maybe we could help expand what you started." The journalist who'd asked to write about the incident was quickly filling her notebook. "What strikes me," she said, looking up from her writing, "is how you handled everything with such dignity. Most viral stories these days are about conflict, but this is about transformation." Mr. Harrison, who'd been quietly listening, spoke up again. "I keep thinking about those girls in the schools you built," he said, his voice carrying a hint of emotion. "My own daughter is about to start college, and I've never once worried about her right to an education. I've taken so much for granted." The flight attendant returned with fresh drinks for everyone, lingering to join the conversation. "My grandmother wasn't allowed to finish high school," she shared. "She always said education is a gift that nobody can take from you." Hearing about your work overseas, well, it would have made her proud. Michelle pulled out her phone and scrolled through more photos. "This is from our opening day at the second school," she explained, showing a picture of smiling students in their new classroom. "The local community helped build it. They worked alongside our troops, and by the end, we weren't soldiers and civilians. We were just people working together for something good." A quiet gentleman who hadn't spoken much finally joined in. "I'm an architect," he said. "I design luxury hotels, but seeing those school buildings," he paused, taking off his glasses to wipe them. "They're more beautiful than any five-star resort I've ever created, because they're built with purpose." The young girl from economy class had sneaked up to peek through the seats again. "Do they have libraries in those schools?" she asked. Her mother came to apologize for the interruption, but Michelle waved her closer. "They're building their libraries book by book," she explained to the child. "Just like you build anything important, one piece at a time." Mr. Harrison reached for his laptop. "I sit on the board of an educational foundation," he said, his voice different now. Humble, purposeful. "We've never considered international projects, but maybe it's time we expanded our horizons. Colonel, would you be willing to speak at our next board meeting?" The elderly teacher who'd been listening nodded approvingly. "Sometimes the best classrooms aren't rooms at all," he said. "Look at what's happening right here, at 35,000 feet. We're all learning something today." A tech executive across the aisle had been quietly typing on his phone. "I just emailed my team," he announced. "We've been developing educational apps, but we've only focused on markets that can afford tablets and smartphones. After hearing about your work, well, we need to think bigger. Think about kids who deserve the same opportunities but don't have the same resources." Michelle looked around at all these people, strangers an hour ago, now united in a conversation about change and possibility. Even the flight itself felt different. The usual invisible barriers between passengers had melted away, replaced by genuine human connection. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, but nobody seemed to notice. They were too busy sharing ideas, making plans, finding ways to take this moment and turn it into something lasting. What had started as an ugly confrontation at the gate was transforming into a network of people determined to make a difference. Halfway through the flight, something remarkable was happening. The flight attendants had given up trying to maintain the usual boundary between first class and economy. Passengers were mingling, sharing stories, and passing around Michelle's photos of the schools on their phones. "I was there for the third school's opening," the young Air Force member shared, her voice carrying clear emotion. "You should have seen how the whole village came together. The local women cooked this huge feast, and the children performed traditional dances. It wasn't just about education. It was about hope." A quiet lady who'd been listening from her economy seat finally spoke up. "I teach at an inner-city school," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We struggle for basic supplies sometimes, but hearing these stories," she wiped a tear, "it reminds me why we keep pushing forward. Every child deserves a chance." Mr. Harrison, who'd been making notes on his phone, looked up. "I've been texting with my company's board members," he said. "We've just approved an emergency fund for educational initiatives. Colonel, we want to start with your schools. Books, supplies, whatever they need." The tech executive chimed in again, showing his tablet screen. "My team's already working on it. We're designing a learning app that works offline, on basic phones. Simple but effective. The kind of thing that could reach rural areas." A college student who'd been quiet until now raised her hand slightly. "I'm studying engineering," she said. "We have this project about sustainable buildings, but I never thought about applying it to schools in conflict zones. Would it be okay if I used your projects as a case study?" Michelle nodded, touched by how a moment of conflict had bloomed into something so much bigger. "This is exactly what we hoped for," she said. "Not just building schools, but building connections. When people come together, real change happens." The journalist had filled several pages of her notebook. "This isn't just a story about confronting prejudice anymore," she said. "It's about how one moment can spark a movement. Look around. Everyone here is finding ways to help, to contribute." The flight attendant returned with a pile of napkins. Passengers had been asking for paper to write down contact information, website addresses, and project ideas. "In all my years of flying," she said, shaking her head in amazement, "I've never seen anything like this." The young girl from economy was back, this time with a drawing she'd made. It showed a simple school building with children of different colors holding hands around it. "Can you give this to the children in your next school?" she asked Michelle. Her innocence brought fresh tears to several passengers' eyes. Mr. Harrison studied the drawing. "You know," he said quietly, "my grandfather used to say that children see the world the way it should be, not the way we've made it." He looked at Michelle. "Thank you for helping me see it that way too." A retired principal in economy class stood up to share her perspective. "What's happening right here, on this flight, is what education is all about. It's not just about books and buildings. It's about opening minds and hearts." As the plane began its initial descent, phones were exchanged, business cards swapped, and promises made. What had started as an ugly moment of prejudice had transformed into a network of people committed to making a difference. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, this time with a personal touch. "Folks, I've been flying this route for 15 years, and I've never felt the kind of energy I'm feeling on this flight. Whatever you're all doing up there, keep it going. We need more of this in the world. As the plane began its descent into Washington, D.C., the energy in the cabin stayed high. People were no longer just passengers. They had become part of something bigger. The flight attendant had given up announcing that everyone needed to return to their assigned seats. Instead, she smiled and joined the ongoing conversations. "We've created a group chat," the tech executive announced, holding up his phone. "Already got 30 people from the flight signed up. We're calling it Sky High Change. Cheesy, I know, but it fits." People laughed, but they were already pulling out their phones to join. The teacher from the inner-city school was deep in conversation with Mr. Harrison. "Our students need computers," she was saying. "Not fancy ones, just basic machines for research and writing." Mr. Harrison nodded, typing quickly on his phone. "Consider it done. My company replaces our laptops every 2 years. They're still perfectly good. I don't know why we never thought of donating them before." A younger passenger who'd been quiet most of the flight finally spoke up. "I run a small YouTube channel about social change," she said. "Would any of you be willing to share your stories? People need to hear about this, not the conflict, but what happened after." The journalist nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly what I was thinking. This isn't just a feel-good story that ends when we land. This is the beginning of something." She showed her notebook, filled with action items and contact information. "I'm calling it the first-class lesson, because the real first-class behavior had nothing to do with airline seats." Michelle watched as more plans took shape. The architect was sketching designs for expandable classrooms on a napkin. The college engineering student was taking photos of his drawings, already thinking about ways to make them sustainable and affordable. The young girl who'd made the drawing was now sitting on her mother's lap, listening to the retired principal tell stories about her years in education. "You know what makes a school special?" the principal asked. "It's not the building. It's the hope inside it." Mr. Harrison stood up carefully as the plane descended. "Before we land," he said, his voice carrying emotion, "I want to say something. This morning, I was that person, the one who judged without thinking, who acted from prejudice instead of understanding. But thanks to the Colonel's grace, I didn't stay that person. None of us are leaving this flight the same as we boarded it." The young Air Force member smiled. "That's what the Colonel always taught us in Afghanistan. Every interaction is a chance to build a bridge or wall. Today, we're building bridges at 30,000 feet." As the plane's wheels touched down at Reagan National Airport, phones lit up with notifications. The group chat was already active. The tech executive had posted links to educational charities. The teacher had shared her school's wish list. Mr. Harrison's foundation had pledged matching funds. The flight attendant made one final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated until we reach the gate. And thank you. Just thank you for showing us what humanity looks like at its best." Michelle gathered her things, touched by how a potentially ugly moment had transformed into something beautiful. Her Pentagon presentation was about building bridges between cultures, but this flight had shown that sometimes those bridges build themselves, when people open their hearts and minds. The young girl tugged at Michelle's sleeve one last time. "My mom says I can start a donation drive at my school," she beamed. "For books for your students. Can I tell them about you?" As passengers filed out of the plane at Reagan National Airport, something unusual happened. Nobody rushed to grab their bags and sprint away. Instead, people lingered, exchanging contact information and making plans. It felt more like leaving a life-changing conference than a routine flight. The gate area became an impromptu meeting space. Mr. Harrison had his phone on speaker, talking to his company's board of directors. "Yes, I know it's unconventional," he was saying, "but I want to redirect our entire community outreach budget. We've been thinking too small for too long." The tech executive had his laptop open on a nearby seat, showing his team's quick mock-up of the educational app. "See, it's simple," he explained to the gathered crowd. "Basic phones can handle it, and it works without constant internet. The content updates whenever there's connection, But kids can keep learning offline. What about translations? The teacher asked, peering at the screen. My students speak 6 different languages. Another passenger, who'd been quiet during the flight, stepped forward. I work for a translation company, she said. We could help with that. Pro bono. Michelle watched as more connections formed. The journalist was interviewing the young Air Force member, capturing stories about how education had transformed villages. The architect and engineering student were deep in discussion about solar-powered classrooms that could be built quickly and cheaply. The retired principal had gathered a small group, organizing what they were calling the Bridge Project, connecting schools across continents. Think about it, she said excitedly. Students here could video chat with students there, when internet allows. Real connections, real understanding. Even the airport staff got involved. A gate agent overheard their conversations and mentioned that her church collected books for charity. We could do a special drive, she offered. Focus on educational materials, especially for younger students. The young girl who'd made the drawing was now sitting cross-legged on the floor, creating more artwork. Other children from the flight had joined her, drawing their own pictures of schools and students holding hands across oceans. Their parents watched, smiling at the pure, uncomplicated way children see the world. Mr. Harrison ended his call and turned to Michelle. We've approved emergency funding, he said. But more than that, we're restructuring our entire charitable giving program. Sometimes it takes a moment of shame to open your eyes to real opportunity. The flight attendant, who'd stayed past her shift to be part of this, was helping organize all the contact information into a spreadsheet. My sister in the Peace Corps won't believe this, she said, shaking her head in amazement. One flight changed so many lives. A businesswoman who had observed everything quietly finally spoke up. I have a friend at the Department of Education, she said. She oversees international education initiatives. Would you all be interested in presenting these ideas to her? This could become a national program. Michelle looked at her watch. Her Pentagon briefing was in 2 hours. The presentation she prepared seemed small now, compared to what had sprouted from one difficult moment at an airport gate. Real change, she realized, often starts in the most unexpected places. The young girl brought her new collection of drawings to Michelle. We made these for your schools, she said proudly. Each picture showed something different. Libraries, playgrounds, children learning. But they all shared the same spirit of hope and connection. As airport announcements echoed overhead and new flights began boarding at nearby gates, this group of former strangers stood together, united by purpose. They weren't just dreaming about change anymore. They were planning it, funding it, making it real. 1 month later, Michelle stood in front of a packed conference room at the Department of Education. The story of that flight had spread, first through the journalist's article, then through social media, and finally through national news. But what made headlines wasn't the initial confrontation. It was what happened after. Mr. Harrison stood beside her at the podium, a changed man from that morning at the airport. Our foundation has already delivered 200 laptops to inner-city schools, he announced. And that's just the beginning. Next week, we start shipping educational supplies to the overseas schools. The tech executives team had finished their learning app in record time. 20,000 downloads in the first week, he shared proudly. Students from remote villages to urban centers are using it. And thanks to our translation volunteers, it's now available in 12 languages. The young girl who'd made the drawings was there too, standing with her class. Her school had started a pen pal program with one of the Afghan schools. Dear friend, she read from a letter she'd received. Thank you for the books. I love reading about science. Maybe one day we can be doctors together. The teacher from the flight had tears in her eyes. Her inner-city school had received so many donations that they'd started sharing with other schools in their district. It's not just about the supplies, she explained. It's about showing our students that they matter, that people care. The architect's designs for sustainable classrooms had caught the attention of international aid organizations. Construction was already underway on 2 new schools, using local materials and labor, creating jobs while building hope. The young Air Force member, now stationed at the Pentagon, shared photos from her recent deployment. "The changes in just 1 month are incredible," she said. "More families are sending their daughters to school. The community feels supported. This is how you build peace, one classroom at a time." Michelle watched as more success stories poured in. The flight attendant had started a program with her airline to carry educational supplies on flights to developing countries. The retired principal's bridge project had connected 50 schools across 3 continents. But the real story, the journalist said, standing to share her perspective, isn't in the numbers. It's in the change we've seen in ourselves. One moment of confrontation could have ended in anger. Instead, it sparked a movement. Mr. Harrison nodded, his eyes misting. "I spent years chasing success," he admitted. "But I never felt successful until I started helping others succeed. That flight didn't just change my mind. It changed my heart." The Department of Education officials were scribbling notes frantically. This grassroots movement had accomplished more in 1 month than many formal programs did in years. They wanted to expand it nationally, create a framework for other communities to follow. As the meeting ended, Michelle received another photo on her phone. Students at one of their new schools, holding up thank you signs. Among them was a large, colorful drawing, sent by the young girl from the flight, now framed on their classroom wall. "People keep asking me if I'm proud of standing up to prejudice that day," Michelle told the room. "But that's not what I'm proud of. I'm proud of everyone in this room, everyone who chose to be part of the solution. We didn't just build schools. We built bridges between hearts." The young girl raised her hand one last time. "My teacher says that sometimes the best lessons happen outside the classroom," she said, "like on airplanes." Everyone laughed, but they knew she was right. As people filed out of the conference room, making plans for the next phase of their work, Michelle thought back to that morning at Atlanta International. Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes, if we face them with grace, hope, and the belief that everyone deserves a chance to learn, grow, and become their best selves.